Wars rarely begin with a single missile. They begin with ideas, with revolutions, with doctrine, with promises leaders make to their people that cannot be easily undone. To understand why conflict between Iran and Israel felt inevitable by 2026, we must return to 1979. Before that year, Iran and Israel were not enemies. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran quietly maintained cooperative ties with Israel. Both were aligned, to varying degrees, with Western powers. Both feared Soviet expansion. Both operated within a regional balance built on pragmatic interests. Then, everything changed. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and replaced the monarchy with an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The revolution was not merely political, it was ideological. The new regime defined itself in opposition to Western influence and, critically, in opposition to Israel. Israel was no longer just a regional state. It became, in Tehran's official rhetoric, an illegitimate entity, a symbol of Western intervention and regional injustice. That ideological foundation matters, because once hostility becomes embedded in state identity, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. For Israel, the revolution transformed Iran from a distant regional actor into a long-term threat. Israel's security doctrine has always been built on a simple principle: never allow existential threats to mature. Surrounded by adversaries since its founding in 1948, Israel developed a culture of preemption, striking early, decisively, and sometimes unilaterally. So by the early 1980s, the seeds were planted. Iran defined itself against Israel. Israel viewed revolutionary Iran as a destabilizing force. But open war did not erupt immediately. Instead, the conflict evolved indirectly. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Iran began cultivating relationships with armed groups across the region. The most significant was Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah was more than an ally. It was a strategic extension of Iranian influence. For Israel, Hezbollah represented a growing security nightmare along its northern border. Rockets, militancy, cross-border skirmishes. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 was not simply a border dispute. It was a proxy confrontation between Israel and Iran. And this is where the pattern becomes clear. Rather than attack each other directly, both nations fought through intermediaries. Iran extended its influence into Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Israel responded with targeted airstrikes against Iranian positions in Syria, attempting to prevent weapons transfers and entrenchment. Each strike carried a message. Each retaliation carried a warning. But neither side fully crossed the line into declared war. Why? Because both understood the cost. Iran lacked the conventional military parity to challenge Israel directly. Israel, in turn, recognized that striking Iran's core territory risked triggering a broader regional war. So the shadow war continued. Then came the nuclear question. By the early 2000s, international scrutiny intensified around Iran's nuclear program. Tehran insisted its ambitions were peaceful, focused on energy and scientific development. Israel was not convinced. From Israel's perspective, a nuclear-armed Iran was an unacceptable risk, not simply a military challenge, but a strategic game-changer, an ideological adversary potentially shielded by nuclear deterrence. Israeli officials repeatedly declared they would not allow Iran to cross that threshold. Sanctions followed. Covert operations allegedly targeted nuclear scientists and facilities. Cyber attacks disrupted centrifuges. Diplomatic agreements were signed, suspended, revived, and strained. The 2015 nuclear deal temporarily eased tensions, placing limits on enrichment in exchange for sanction relief. But mistrust never vanished. When the agreement weakened and oversight mechanisms faltered, old fears resurfaced.
In Israel's strategic calculus, time was narrowing. In Iran's domestic politics, resistance against external pressures strengthened hardline narratives. The rhetoric sharpened. And rhetoric matters, because language shapes public expectation. When leaders frame an adversary as existential, compromise becomes politically dangerous. By the late 1910s and early 2020s, the shadow war intensified. Israeli strikes in Syria increased in frequency. Iranian-backed militias expanded their reach. Rocket arsenals grew. Precision missile capabilities improved. The line between proxy and direct confrontation blurred further. Then came a dangerous shift. In 2024, direct exchanges escalated beyond the familiar proxy framework. Missile salvos were launched openly. Retaliatory strikes became more visible, more public, more overt. This was no longer deniable conflict. It was signaling. Each side was testing the other's red lines. And red lines, once crossed without decisive consequence, tend to fade. By the beginning of 2026, a short but intense confrontation erupted, 12 days of strikes and counterstrikes. The world held its breath. Energy markets trembled. Global leaders rushed to mediate. A fragile ceasefire followed. But fragile is the key word, because nothing fundamental had changed. Iran's regional posture remained intact. Israel's security doctrine remained uncompromising. The nuclear dispute remained unresolved. Proxy networks remained armed. The 2025 truce did not solve the conflict. It paused it. And pauses in prolonged rivalries often function not as endings, but as recalibrations. Both sides analyzed the confrontation. Both refined their strategies. Both prepared for the next round. This is how inevitability forms. Not through a single mistake, not through one miscalculation, but through accumulated decisions that narrow alternatives. By the beginning of 2026, tensions were no longer hypothetical. The question was no longer whether confrontation would escalate. The question was when, and who would make the first irreversible move. In Part 2, we examine that breaking point, the moment strategic logic overtook restraint, the moment decades of rivalry transformed into open war, and why, by then, many leaders on both sides believed they had no other choice.
In Part 1, we trace the decades, the revolution, the ideology, the proxy wars, the nuclear standoff, the fragile 2025 ceasefire that convinced the world the worst had been avoided. But ceasefires can be illusions, because while headlines declared de-escalation, the structural pressures remained untouched. By early 2026, both Iran and Israel faced a strategic dilemma, and both believed time was running out. For Israel, the central fear had not changed since the early 2000s, a nuclear-capable Iran protected by a hardened network of regional proxies. Israeli intelligence assessments suggested that Iran's nuclear threshold, the point at which weaponization could become feasible, was dangerously close. Even if Tehran denied military intent, the capability itself altered the balance of power. In Israeli security doctrine, existential threats are not managed, they are prevented. And prevention in Israeli strategic culture often means preemption. For Iran, the calculus was different, but equally rigid. Years of sanctions had strained the economy. Regional influence had become a pillar of regime legitimacy. Confrontation with Israel was not merely foreign policy, it was embedded in revolutionary identity. Backing down publicly would risk appearing weak domestically and regionally. The regime's credibility depended on resistance. So both sides were locked into narratives they could not easily abandon. Then came the trigger. In mid-2026, intelligence leaks and satellite imagery fueled speculation that Israel, reportedly with U.S. coordination, was preparing targeted strikes on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. Iran responded with warnings. Israel responded with silence. And then the strikes began. Precision attacks targeted key facilities, command centers, and strategic assets. The objective was clear: degrade capabilities before they matured further. But preemption rarely ends conflicts, it accelerates them. Iran retaliated. Missile barrages reached deeper than previous exchanges. Regional militias mobilized. Hezbollah escalated pressure along Israel's northern border. Air defense systems lit up the skies. Within days, what had once been a shadow war became overt. And here is the critical insight. Neither side appeared surprised. Contingency plans were activated almost immediately. Reserve forces were mobilized with efficiency that suggested preparation, not improvisation. This was not an accidental spiral. It was a confrontation both militaries had been rehearsing for years. So why was it inevitable? Because over decades, the strategic incentives converged toward confrontation. First, mutual perception of existential risk. Israel viewed a nuclear-capable Iran as intolerable. Iran viewed Israeli strikes as proof of permanent hostility. When both sides perceive survival at stake, restraint weakens. Second, institutionalized retaliation. Every strike demanded response. Every response demanded counter-response. Over time, escalation becomes normalized. What once would have triggered total war becomes limited exchange. Thresholds erode. Third, proxy saturation. The regional web of armed groups meant that even limited strikes had cascading effects. A hit in Syria could ignite Lebanon. A strike on Iranian soil could mobilize militias in Iraq or Yemen. Containment became nearly impossible. Fourth, diplomatic exhaustion. Repeated negotiations over nuclear limitations, sanctions relief, and regional security frameworks failed to build durable trust. Temporary agreements slowed momentum. They did not alter trajectory. And finally, domestic political incentives. Leaders on both sides faced internal pressures that rewarded strength over compromise. In Israel, political factions emphasized deterrence and credibility. In Iran, hardline elements framed resistance as national pride. De-escalation required political risk. Escalation offered political clarity. So by 2026, war was not inevitable in the mystical sense. It was inevitable in the structural sense. Every previous crisis had narrowed the menu of alternatives. Each confrontation hardened doctrine. Each failed negotiation deepened cynicism. When the strikes landed in 2026, they were dramatic, but they were not surprising. And here is the deeper tragedy. For nearly 5 decades, both sides insisted they sought deterrence. But deterrence requires stable red lines. In this rivalry, red lines kept shifting. When Israel struck Iranian positions in Syria, it was framed as defensive. When Iran armed proxies, it was framed as strategic depth. When sanctions were imposed, they were framed as leverage. When enrichment levels rose, they were framed as bargaining tools. Each move justified itself. Collectively, they built a staircase to confrontation. The aftermath was immediate and global. Oil markets reacted sharply. Shipping routes through the region grew uncertain. Allies reassessed commitments. The United States faced difficult choices about involvement and escalation control. Gulf states weighed security concerns against economic stability. The humanitarian dimension intensified as civilian populations braced for prolonged instability. But the long-term consequences may be even more significant. This war reshaped regional alignments. It reinforced the perception that indirect conflict inevitably mutates into direct confrontation. It exposed the limits of deterrence when ideological hostility persists, and it reminded the world that long rivalries rarely dissolve quietly. The phrase inevitable war is uncomfortable. It suggests inevitability as destiny. But inevitability in geopolitics usually means something else. It means unresolved tensions compounded over time. It means leaders inheriting hardened doctrines. It means political systems that reward confrontation more than compromise. And it means cycles of retaliation that outpace diplomacy. Could it have been avoided? In theory, yes.
if nuclear negotiations had achieved deeper transparency, if regional security frameworks had included broader guarantees, if domestic political climates rewarded de-escalation. But history rarely operates in ideal conditions. Instead, it unfolds within constraints. And by 2026, the constraints were severe. Iran's revolutionary identity had not softened. Israel's security doctrine had not shifted. Proxy networks had not dissolved. Trust had not been rebuilt. When structural conditions persist long enough, outcomes narrow, and war, once unthinkable, becomes rationalized. The lesson of this conflict extends beyond the Middle East. It demonstrates how rivalries, when sustained across generations, can harden into inevitability. It shows how deterrence can drift into escalation, and it reveals how narratives, once embedded in national identity, resist compromise. As the region recalibrates and the world responds, one truth stands out. This was not a sudden eruption. It was the final act of a decades-long trajectory. And trajectories, unless altered deliberately, tend to continue. Whether this war becomes a contained chapter or the beginning of a larger realignment depends on choices still being made. Because inevitability describes the past, it does not have to define the future. The question now is not why the war happened. We understand that. The real question is whether the structural forces that made it inevitable will finally be addressed, or whether they will simply reset the clock for the next confrontation.